Hello, my name is Jared Council. I'm senior editor at Forbes The Culture, and I'm joined today by Jelani Cobb. He is the dean of the Columbia Journalism School, an historian, and a staff writer at The New Yorker. Jelani, great to have you today.
Good to be with you.
I want to start with a report that your school recently released titled Uncovering Inequality. And it analyzes the historical roots of some of the race-based inequities that we have in society today. Give us an overview of this project and what you hope it will accomplish.
So the project came about, we started almost 3 years ago, which is, if you think about it, that puts us around the time of George Floyd's death. And in the immediate aftermath, as we saw protests spreading around the country, I was thinking about the fact that we were in the midst of a pandemic. We were in the midst of a pandemic recession, and we were in the midst of this police racial reckoning. And we were not talking about the fact that all three of those things were disproportionately affecting the same communities. And so this project was meant to look at the structural and historical roots of racial inequality in the United States. And we divided it up into 5 areas: education, housing, healthcare, criminal justice, and economics. And we found 5 teams of researchers and posed the same question to each of them. We said, what does your field know about racial inequality in this particular area over time? And by over time, we meant, I think initially like 30 years, but our people wound up going much further than that. I think on average, it's been about 50 years, and some who've gone back further than that.
Yeah.
And we were hoping and we wanted to distill that information. What does your field know about inequality in these areas? And can you succinctly summarize it in 50 to 75 pages?
It doesn't sound too succinct.
Excuse me?
I said it doesn't sound too succinct, but we'll go ahead.
Well, it's very funny because to academics, that's a haiku to academics. For journalists, that's very lengthy. But I was trying to find a way to get people to the middle ground and, to take a great deal of information or a body of literature around a particular question and boil it down to the essence, 75 pages. You might easily be talking about 7,500 or 8,000 pages of literature that you're summarizing.
Yeah.
And so we got these 5 reports, and that was the first phase of the project. And then the second phase of the project was to give those reports to journalists and just have them generate stories that are connected to this information. So we wanted there to be this meeting of these 2 methodologies, people who were dealing with particular inequities over time, and people who were dealing with the landscape of current affairs and current events. And that's what the project, set out to do. And the most succinct answer I could give you to that question was that we set out to change the parameters of the conversation around inequality in the United States.
Got it. There's obviously a lot of history here in those 5 areas that we're talking about. Are there any surprises or things that are generally not well known that surfaced from this research?
I mean, there's a lot. First, there's a lot that's bleak, and then there's some that's like potentially hopeful. When we looked at, the healthcare inequality, there were these persistent gaps in longevity, persistent gaps in access. Even when there were innovations in healthcare, the pattern was that they would not be applied equally, and that communities of color were constantly lagging behind in terms of healthcare access. In education, we saw segregation and the durability of segregation, the way that it has remained a problematic element of American society. That said, there were moments where schools were generally less segregated than they are now. And one of the interesting findings from the economics report was that, there had been this huge gap, and I mean, still is a persistent gap in wealth, and a persistent gap in earnings between, black and white, and divided along, stratified along racial lines and ethnic lines. But if you were to look at the time period from 1950 to 1970, you had a pretty significant convergence, and
Really?
which was due to lots of different things, but it was less of a pronounced gap between black and white labor, black and white wage earners. And one of the other things that report pointed out was that in the past 8 to 10 years, because of the tight labor market, low income workers who are disproportionately black have also disproportionately benefited from rising wages. And so there are some elements in there that point to things that we could think about and say, how do we replicate this at scale? Or how do we continue these trends? And then also, one of the objectives was to look at the things that we've gotten wrong and say, how do we navigate past reiterating those mistakes?
Yeah. When I see reports like this, and I know you mentioned to me before that this is the first of its kind where you've actually gone out and got other researchers to look at, the issue of race in their fields. But there are a number of reports that come out every year that detail some of the inequalities that we see in our society. And I often think, right, there's the MSNBC audience that would be receptive to this, and then the Fox News audience that may not be so receptive. And so my question for you is, it seems like there might be this element of preaching to the choir here. How do you get beyond that? Do you strive to?
Well, it's not really meant to preach to the choir, or to because MSNBC has one editorial slant and Fox has a different editorial slant. This is material that was meant to help journalists, people who are reporting on this subject matter. And so, irrespective of what you think about it, there is a gap, a gigantic gap in home ownership in this country. And it has roots in very particular policies that are not very controversial. And so, if you are a journalist and you are covering housing, writing, the housing beat, you should know this. You could go to graduate school and spend a couple of years, mastering this huge, sprawling body of literature. Or maybe you read these synopses and it gives you a starting place to understand how these things have operated. And so one of the things that I think, what these facts mean to people can be subject to interpretation, but the facts will still remain the facts. And what we were trying to do is help journalists have access to more facts.
Understood. Speaking of history, as you're well aware of, there are efforts across this country to water down, let's just say, Black history education in schools. And earlier this year, you helped draft an open letter to education officials in Florida. I just want to read part of it. And by the way, the issue here was there was an AP African American Studies course, and officials there believed that it lacked educational value. And what the letter said in part was, this has terrible consequences for the young people of color who live in that state, end quote. My question for you is, are people of color the only ones impacted by these efforts?
No, I mean, I think that one of the things that we have to push back on is the idea that the history of Black people in this country is only pertinent to Black people in this country. And, for instance, during Black History Month, I gave a talk about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is explicitly tied to the end of slavery and the ambiguous status that the former slaves held in terms of their citizenship. But it also is at the corner of everything now, from debates about immigration to the corporate personhood status to all sorts of other things that are integral to American life. But it begins in this one particular place. And so it's crucial that we engage with our history in its entirety. And that affects every single one of us, who live in this country. But the incentive for this, I think, has been an attempt to stifle the conversation about race and about the particular dynamics of a fairly ugly portion of the country's history.
Yeah. If this trend continues and this becomes the norm in more states, what do you think the outcome will be?
Oh, well, I don't think anything good will come from suppressing that kind of history, and we've seen, what the results of that have been. Famously, of course, is the Santayana quote. Those who fail to learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. Now, of course, the other side of it is that sometimes we repeat our history precisely because people have learned from it, meaning that there are people who really want to take us backward to darker and more difficult times. And so that is the only, I think, logical outcome that we can anticipate for something like that.
Yeah. Shifting gears here a little bit. There's a segment of our country that puts these efforts, whether it's Black History education or DEI initiatives in the corporate environment, that put all of these efforts in a so-called woke bucket. And I've heard you say this before, but this idea, like what's going on, is essentially a backlash, and there've been backlashes throughout history. I wonder, do you think there's anything special about the backlash that we're seeing now? Do you think it has any staying power?
It's special in the fact that it's happening now. Like, this is what's happening in our particular moment in our lives.
Right, but compared to others, is there anything else that kind of stands out about it? Does it have any staying power in terms of being enshrined in policy?
I mean, it is enshrined in policy already. We've already seen the voting legislation and the other kinds of things that are going on with suppression of information and people's access to teach, ability to teach, on subject matter that touches upon thorny issues. All that is already policy. So, but I don't know what the ultimate outcome of this will be, but it just will, I think it's sufficient to say that it fits the pattern, of previous periods that we've been in, where we've seen these kind of dynamics. And I think that's also one of the things that we wanted to do with the report, is kind of look at what you would see if you took what appears to be a contemporary problem and spread your analysis over 5 or 6 or 7 decades. At that point, the scale, changes and things begin to look, familiar. The patterns begin to look familiar. And that's one of the things that we were hoping to do with those reports.
Yeah. Some of these issues are already shaping up to be themes for the 2024 election cycle. I wonder, how should, just putting on your Dean of Journalism school hat on, how should journalists approach their work in an era where race is such a major theme or undercurrent for a lot of issues?
I think that there are, if I were to take it from that subject to, a different one, if we were talking about climate, people think that, reporting about climate only entails, heat waves and floods, or hurricanes, like the most obvious elements of disaster. But in fact, if you're reporting about climate, you were talking about the economy, you were talking about food, you were talking about labor and labor conditions, you were talking about urban planning, you're talking about government budgets, we're talking a whole array of things that if you are covering those subjects as a journalist, you need to be knowledgeable about climate and climate change. It works in the same sort of way. We have race so thoroughly baked into so many different aspects of American life that, if you are covering healthcare, you need to be cognizant, of these issues. If you are covering housing, you need to be cognizant of these. If you're covering criminal justice, you really need to be cognizant of these issues, or education. So you can't extract yourself from the implications of this subject in all these different facets of American life. And so as we look at the 2024 election, there are lots of instances, especially around the debates over immigration, and especially around the debates over voter access, and all these things that are kind of among the most hot button issues in American life right now. And so I think those are things that students should be prepared to think about, and that journalists should be equipping themselves to think about as they go out and do their work.
Yeah. And staying on the 2024 topic, just in terms of election coverage, is there anything that you hope to see journalists writ large do differently, with the next election compared to how they covered the 2020 election?
Well, I mean, I think that we're operating in a disinformation ecosystem, which is not new. This has been the case for some years now. And my hope is that outlets have become more sophisticated in responding to, and operating in that environment, and thinking about how they respond to disinformation initiatives and, the various sorts of challenges that come with the landscape.
Gotcha. And I mean, you have a front row seat to, the next generation of journalists. What stands out about them, and how do you think that they're going to approach the issue of race, when they enter the workforce?
I think that we have really, at Columbia, we've distinguished ourselves for a long time, with the caliber of our students and the caliber of our graduates. I think that students are generally more aware of the social fault lines, having lived through the pandemic and seen who was most affected by the pandemic, and having seen the kind of toll of economic inequality and a whole array of very pressing matters. And so the ambition of Joseph Pulitzer when he founded this school in 1912, rather when it was founded by his estate at his bequest, was to train journalists who could hold power to account. And that is the mission that we have embarked upon in 1912, and the one that we have continued to pursue for the last 111 years.
Yeah. What do you say to people who say, there's a lot of research out there about some of these disparities that we see, and the history of these disparities, but not a lot of solutions? What would you tell them?
I don't think that it's the case that there are not a lot of solutions. It's more likely that we've lacked the will to enact, the solutions that we have. And I think that's one of the other things that's important about the reports, which is that they highlight some of the points of convergence. For instance, it's not coincidental that in 1965, after there was Social Security reform, and minimum wage reform, rather, you saw a convergence in the black-white income gap. And the fact is that minimum wage laws had excluded categories of work that African Americans were largely clustered in. And when that changed, it had a huge impact on the lives of millions of people. And so I think there's, combing through those reports, there's moment after moment after moment like that. But what we have generally lacked is the sustained will to enact those kinds of policies and hold on to them.
Yeah, and speaking of that, even if there is, I want to ask you about the Supreme Court, which has a very has what looks like a durable conservative majority, and a lot of these issues around policy changes that can help close some of these gaps are appearing on their desk. And I wonder, what you think about, I guess, how that policy will, and that fight on that front will change I mean, we already have the Supreme Court majority that I'm speaking of, but what do you think the implications of that majority are on, again, this will to change policy?
I mean, I can't say. I mean, I'm like everybody else waiting to hear, what comes down from the Supreme Court when they make decisions. I think that there are a lot of people who know more than I do about law that think that this court may not be, sympathetic to the arguments that have typically been deployed in defense of policies like, for instance, affirmative action. But I really would withhold my opinion until we actually have a decision from them and something to respond to.
Right. Understood. What do you think? Again, the fact that they haven't been sympathetic to these issues in the past, what will that mean for journalists that are covering these topics?
Not sure. Again, I can't say, and like everyone, will wait to see. I will say, in a related subject, that's really crucial that we have a diverse journalism corps. That journalism should look like the communities it covers. And we are in favor of anything that allows us to put together, classes and alumni groups and a core of reporters who represent the diversity of the country.
Got it. And last thing for you, again, this topic, as you know, has a lot of elements that are bleak. And so I'm curious to know, what are you hopeful about as it relates to race in society, as it relates to how the media covers these issues?
I've seen in the last 5 to 7 years improvement and growth in terms of people's recognition of the centrality of race as an issue that has to be covered. And there were kind of introductory conversations that we used to have all the time that we don't have to have as much anymore. And so that gives me, kind of guarded optimism around it. But the real kind of, I guess, source of optimism is the people who are out in the trenches, day in, day out, year in, year out, doing the work of making sure that people have the information that we need to have in order to make decisions, particularly, around the fault line of race in this country, which is why, why we did the reports.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to end it there. Thanks for the time, Jelani.
Thank you. All right. Take care.